for that event on our website or with me after tonight's presentation. Tonight's speaker is an Emmy Award-winning documentary producer for HBO, PBS, History Channel, and others. He attained a master's in American history from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and teaches at Avenues, the World School in New York City. Here to discuss his book, New York City Monuments of Black Americans, A History and Guide, please welcome David Felsen.
Okay, take it easy. How we doing? Thanks everyone for coming out. Thank you to Zach and the Northeast Harbor Library for kindly inviting me to talk to you about this topic that I care a lot about. I'm going to take you through a little bit about sort of why I wrote the book, and then I sort of want to tell you a little bit about the evolution of how Black Americans came to be represented in monuments in New York City, sort of from symbols to real historical figures. Then I'll ask questions. You guys feel free to ask questions along the way. I'll take a little break so you can ask questions, get caught up. I teach American history at Avenues, the World School in Chelsea in Manhattan. And so as a teacher, I'm contractually obligated to give you a pop quiz. So just right off the bat, what do all these people have in common? A lot of presidents, a lot of men. Not all. You guys are ahead of. Okay, men. I heard slaveholders. What else? Sorry. Bad hair days. Yeah, consistent, fairly consistent. Not all of them. Certainly a lot of them in the military. All people who. Something. Oh, yeah. So. Yes. So Posey's on to something here. I feel like I know just about everyone in the crowd here, so forgive me if I use people's names. But so these are the top 50 individuals as represented in monuments in the United States. And this was a group, in 2021, a group called Monument Lab out of Philadelphia, did an audit of all the monuments in the country. And this is right around the time of the Confederate removal and the murder of George Floyd. And they did this audit, and they came up with these as the top 50 individuals who are represented in U.S. public monuments. Anything else we notice about these folks? Certainly, they're all significant, impactful. Mostly white, mostly male. Yeah, we have a handful of women. So we see there's Harriet Tubman. Any other women? Certainly. We have, in terms of the women, we have Harriet Tubman, we have Joan of Arc, and we have Sacagawea. Black men? Yeah, just MLK and Frederick Douglass. And the majority, a lot of these men are either presidents or generals or both. And so only 3 Black Americans represented. And the conclusion that Monument Lab came to after this audit was that the story, this is a big shocker, but the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents history. That was their big takeaway, which I think it's a fair claim. So I wrote this book sort of in the time, I guess, because with my students, I think it's important to, I use monuments a lot to talk about how values change over time in society, how monuments represent. There's sort of the evidence of the values of society at a given point in time and how that changes. I also like monuments because, as you probably noticed, people have strong feelings about them. They cause controversy, as I'll discuss in a little bit. And so a few years ago, in the midst of the Confederate removal moment and the George Floyd murder, I just started wondering about how monuments, how African Americans were being represented in the monuments in New York City. I'm a historian. I was trying to do some research to understand how that came to be, and there just wasn't a lot of information. So that's why I decided to write the book. So real quick, how many people are from New York City here? Feels like we have a pretty decent representation, or people, if you're not from New York City, maybe you spent significant time. You certainly spent time there. So there are about 300 figurative public statues, so like not just abstract, but figurative, something that represents a person in the parks and streets of New York City. So how many of those do you think include Black Americans? Not many. Anyone want to take a guess? 20? That's not bad. That's close. Do we think she's close? She's close. 5? 50. Okay. So yeah. So there are 30 monuments of Black Americans in New York City, and that I've identified. I should say that since I wrote the book, there's a couple more that have popped up inconveniently, but that's fine. That's just sort of the way history works. But and I'm actually going to tell you a little bit about one of them in a bit. So just a couple. This is the map of all the monuments that I identified in the city. And I guess a couple things to be aware of. About 80 years ago, more than half of these statues wouldn't have been there. And there'd be no statues of real historical Black Americans, no historical figures, just sort of symbolic representations. Many of the statues were of real white Americans, though, and mostly sort of military figures. There are about 150 public statues of real historical real historical figures in New York City. Only 16 of them are of real Black Americans. And so in the same way that the monuments in the nation don't really accurately represent our history, I think the monuments in New York City kind of follow suit. They don't really accurately represent the history of New York City. And so again, that was something that sort of motivated me to tell that story. One example of this sort of national misrepresentation is the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., which some of you may be familiar with. It's by Thomas Ball, and it was dedicated on April 14th, 1876. It was a big deal. You have to understand, when monuments were dedicated, it was like a movie opening. Thousands of people would show up. And at this particular event, Ulysses S. Grant is there, and he speaks. Frederick Douglass is there, and he has something to say. And so it's a big deal. So what are some of the things that we see and notice? What's sort of the story that's being told in this first sort of national monument, which includes an African American? A white savior. Sorry? The enslaved person is kneeling below, right? In the hierarchy of the image, right? He is. So you can shackled. He has shackles. The shackles are broken, but he is shackled. Anything else? The man who's kneeling. Yeah, he's actually he's barely. It is. He's wearing a loincloth. He's actually. It's funny because the model for this statue was an ancestor of Muhammad Ali. So you talk about him being well built, but. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The first time I saw this is like, is he levitating this guy? What's going on? Or a benediction. Interesting, right? But all these sort of things that we think of. He's certainly in the hierarchy of the image. All the sort of gestures are showing sort of the superiority of the white savior over the enslaved person who is rising, right? He is becoming free. He is becoming emancipated. But we certainly would say this doesn't really represent, when we think this man has no agency or very little agency. And we think about emancipation prior to the Civil War, during the Civil War, it's really a series of like thousands of individual acts of emancipation, enslaved people who are choosing to be free, trying to be free, as opposed to Abraham Lincoln just waving a magic wand and it all going away. A couple other interesting things about this monument. It was also, the idea came from a formerly enslaved woman, Charlotte Scott, who the morning after Lincoln was assassinated, she gave her former owner, this is comic, she gave her former owner a $5 donation. She said, somehow, some way, we have to find a monument to represent emancipation. And from that, it was most of the funding actually came from formerly enslaved people, a lot of them Union soldiers. But the actual concept of the monument was developed by an all-white commission. And so that's where we end up with this, as opposed to maybe something that African Americans would have designed if they could have. Another interesting, I think I mentioned to you that Frederick Douglass is there, and he didn't like what he saw. And he shared his thoughts not too long after the publication. Sorry, there's a little blip there on the screen. So he says to the editor of the National Republican, this is actually a letter that just came out a few weeks, like a couple months ago, this was discovered. Sorry, not a couple months ago, about a year ago, they discovered this letter to the editor. He says, the Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant, like kneeling on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man. And Douglass, he understood the importance of image. He had himself photographed, I think, close to 160 times. He's arguably the most photographed man in the 19th century, more than Abraham Lincoln. He wrote his own autobiography 3 times. The Slave Narrative, which if you have a chance to read, it's incredible. If you have a chance to read anything by Frederick Douglass, I highly recommend it. He's arguably the most, he's on a par in terms of, as an orator, on a par with Lincoln in the 19th century, one of the best writers in the 19th century. He believed that it mattered how black people were portrayed in monuments, because their portrayal had the power to either promote sort of existing racist stereotypes or contradict them. And so he didn't like what he saw. Good news is that Douglass does actually get a monument that he would have appreciated. This is after he dies. This is in Rochester, where he settled for a time, the Frederick Douglass Monument, which is still there in Rochester, New York. New York City, unfortunately, doesn't get a monument of Frederick Douglass until 2011. So it takes a long time for New York City to catch up with, and that's sort of typical. We'll see as we go along, we'll sort of see that's kind of typical of the way things have gone in New York City. All right. This is the monument that I used to think was the first monument that included African Americans in New York City. It's actually the second, and I'll explain why in a moment. But it is the first Civil War memorial that includes an African American. And so this is I'm sort of going to talk a little bit about the evolution of how black people were represented. This is like a 30-foot column in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which if you have a chance to go visit, I don't know if it really, it's fantastic, Greenwood Cemetery. It's one of the nation's first rural cemeteries, beautiful. And the 30-foot column is the Soldiers Monument, dedicated in 1876, not long after the Thomas Ball Emancipation Memorial. And it tells the story around the base of a Union soldier, sort of the life cycle of a Union soldier, from him signing up to fighting to dying. And then this is he's been buried somewhere in the South. And I think you can see his widow and his son have come to find the grave, and who's leading them to the grave? It's a freedman. It's a formerly enslaved man who is leading this Union soldier's widow to the grave. And sort of typical of this period, we have, and what we'll see for pretty much the first half a century or so of black representation, he is a supporting character. Right? He's not the hero. He has brought the widow and her child to the grave, but he's a sort of background actor. He is barefooted, right? And that's his role. And I should say that it's not all that surprising. Well, a couple things. The inscription of the monument says it's meant to honor the heroic dead of the, quote, 148,000 citizens of New York City who enlisted in aid of the war for the preservation of the Union and the Constitution. There's no mention of this man, no mention of the chief cause of the war, which many people would argue is slavery, right? No mention in the monument, no mention in any of the coverage at the event. And again, like the Emancipation Memorial, thousands of people show up in Greenwood Cemetery to see this statue unveiled, and none of them would have had any clue that the war was fought over slavery. At least that was not mentioned. There was no mention of the 4,000 African Americans from New York State who fought for the Union. But that's not necessarily that surprising, given if you understand the history of New York City at the time. In 1876, the government's pro-Confederacy. And this is, I should say, it was the city government that paid for the dedication of this monument. Just 6 years earlier, a Tammany Hall candidate ran for state office on the slogan, quote, "No suffrage nor Negro equality, white man's government for white men. White men shall rule America." So fairly clear where they stood. Also, the black population in New York is only 2% at that point, right? And the North is generally turning against Reconstruction. 1876, 1877, where we are, the North, is turning away from Reconstruction. We're kind of over it. We've lost our attention span is not what it might be, or it might have been. So maybe that helps to explain it a little bit. If it doesn't exactly justify it, it maybe explains it. So I mentioned that I found this other monument. This is it. This is the DeWitt Clinton Monument, which I only became aware of about 3 months ago when I was on a tour of Greenwood Cemetery. And I just wanted to show it to you because it's actually the first that I'm aware of. And if anyone knows of any other monuments in New York City that include African Americans prior to this, please let me know, because there's so many monuments in the city, it's hard to keep track. But this is the Governor DeWitt Clinton statue. And DeWitt Clinton, you may or may not know, was responsible for bringing the Erie Canal to New York. The reason why we think of New York as the Empire State, it's because of the Erie Canal. He makes New York City the most important port in the world, arguably. And so this is a statue that was, he was eventually buried in Greenwood Cemetery, and they thought this would be a good way to attract attention, actually, to draw other people to get buried in Greenwood Cemetery, was by building a monument to DeWitt Clinton. And in this monument, there's a bas-relief which shows this African-American laborer who is actually carrying a box of Virginia plug tobacco. And it's interesting because it's not really clear, his status is not clear. So when the canal was built in 1825, slavery is still in effect in New York State. New York State has this bizarre thing known as gradual emancipation. So 1827 is when slavery ends effectively in New York State. So we're not sure if he's free or enslaved. There are some chains around his feet, you may notice, but those actually are connected to the horse. He's shirtless, okay, and shoeless. He's the only shirtless and shoeless person in this bas-relief, which is showing people working on the Erie Canal. So it's just not really clear what his status is. Also, one thing I've been noticing is looking back at this, if you look at just what do we notice about Clinton's outfit? If you just take a look at that for a second. Yeah. So he's like by day, 19th century statesman, by night like a Roman emperor. I don't know. He's sort of half and half, but this is also a reflection of 19th century obsession with sort of neoclassicism, and American statesmen, obviously, or not obviously, but we're certainly obsessed with the classical period. Everyone talks about George Washington sort of imitating the Romans and deciding to go back to his farm at Mount Vernon, right? So there's this whole sort of obsession that American politicians have with the classical period, and so do the sculptors. This is Henry Kirk Brown, who's like the first great American sculptor, the first American sculptor who has these mammoth statues actually cast here in Massachusetts. And so you're sort of seeing that at play here, the kind of this almost like a schizophrenic view of like what an American politician should be. Is he American? Is he Roman? Where's he stand? So I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, and again, just in terms of this monument being consistent with the themes that we were talking about earlier, the enslaved man, or not the enslaved man, the African-American man is shoeless, shirtless, and he is supporting cast in the narrative of the great white hero. Any questions so far? Yeah, the bas relief is, if you look at that again. And there's, I think it's the Ames casting company somewhere up in Massachusetts. But Henry Kirk Brown, he trained in Rome and then had his own, he's funny, he had like a studio in New York for a while, but it was too busy and too crazy and loud for him in Manhattan, so he moved out to Brooklyn, like a lot of people do, and started on Pacific Street, he had his own little studio there, and he sort of like becomes the dean of the American sculpture. John Quincy Ward, who's, we're actually I won't show you one of his statues later, but he's another famous American sculptor who was influenced by Henry Kirk Brown. Any other questions? Okay, yeah. Yeah, and I don't know. Like that's a valid question. Is this an aesthetic choice, right? And we know that African Americans played. Yeah, yeah. There's a Native American to it. There's a Native American couple and a child in the lower left-hand corner, but you can't really see their physiques. Yeah, the African American is the only one whose physique you can really see, and you don't know, is that an aesthetic choice? Is there some kind of statement? I'm in the midst of writing a piece about this, so I've sent away for his, he had a nephew who wrote a book about him that no one ever read, but you can get it at the University of Delaware, and I'm waiting to get copies of it to find out more, like, well, what was Henry Kirk Brown thinking? I just don't know. Not clear. It's totally possible. It could just be an aesthetic choice. Okay. Just a quick art history check to remind you that here sort of we're looking now at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and City Beautiful kind of takes off in not just New York City, but New York City, places like Chicago. It's really the Columbian Exposition in 1893 that really kicks it off. And it's this reform movement to make urban environments beautiful and inspiring. And statues play a huge part in this. And one of the things that they were hoping, the people behind this movement, is it would teach this huge influx of immigrants, all these people coming from all around the world. How do you teach them about our values, our history, right? So maybe you do that with beautiful buildings like this, right? You see sort of classical values on display. This is the New York Public Library, classic example of sort of City Beautiful, which is plastered, or not plastered, but surrounded by statues, not just Patience and Fortitude, the two lions out front, but lots of philosophers and things like that. So hoping to use the urban environment to teach these floods of immigrants. So the question is sort of, what are they learning, right? So I think what they're learning is a little strange. I think even with there's this monument that I'm going to show you in a moment to Henry Ward Beecher, the lesson is it's a little bit what we would say problematic. Even an abolitionist monument is problematic. So Henry Ward Beecher, a Congregationalist preacher from in Brooklyn Heights, the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, and he's the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, for what it's worth, is the second best-selling book in the 19th century after the Bible. And incredible success, the impact of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her brother was also an ardent abolitionist, and he was known for, among other things, holding reverse slave auctions. So this is a sketch of the interior of Plymouth Church, which is really famous still to this day. It's still an existing congregation, but Abraham Lincoln worshiped there, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. There's still like an Abraham Lincoln pew at Plymouth Church, it's a great Plymouth Church. No, in Brooklyn Heights. Yeah. So he would hold a reverse slave auction, which was essentially, this is an instance where there was an African-American woman who was enslaved in Washington, D.C. She was very light-skinned, She was at a slave yard not a yard, yeah, a slave yard there, and the owner of the slave yard was sort of conflicted and said, he said, okay, you can bring her up to New York, and if people buy her there, you can buy her freedom, essentially. And so he did a number of these, but you can imagine what it would be like for the woman there having her freedom sold, as bizarre, pretty bizarre circumstance. But so that's one of the things he sort of gets his name for. And this is the monument to him, which sort of shows, and again, this is by Gutzon Borglum, and it was dedicated at the Plymouth Church in 1914. Borglum's also known for Mount Rushmore and Stone Mountain in Georgia, the Confederate Memorial. So he's doing, it's so funny when I go through this, all these sculptors are they're clearly hired guns. They don't seem to care, like, okay, I'm gonna do a Union monument one week, and the next week I'm gonna do a Confederate monument. I don't care, I'm just getting paid. And so he's doing Henry Ward Beecher, and you can see again sort of this idea of, we have these two women who are, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them, but again, he is sort of the white savior on high with the enslaved victims below. And there's a story about 2 years before the dedication of this memorial in the Brooklyn Eagle, and it describes Borglum's work as showing Beecher as he appeared in the pulpit when he auctioned off the freedom of the sisters Emily and Mary Edmondson, and who were huddled at the base. According to the Eagle, one of them watches like a hunted animal the face of the great preacher, the other nestles into her embrace. Okay, so that's sort of this description of them. And then a couple years ago, after that, the coverage of the dedication talks about the unveiling and his tiny granddaughters who pull off the veil, and the Reverend Hillis reads about how Beecher saw the wrongs of slavery, clearly, and felt them passionately, and acted with every drop of blood in his body to bring an end to slavery. But this same article mentions nothing about the Edmondson sisters, and I don't know why. I can't figure it out. There's a lot of coverage of this moment, but there's no discussion about these girls, so I don't know why that went away. It just said they're two young slave girls. And it didn't bother to identify them or tell their sort of remarkable story. So that's what every time I give a speech, I want to talk about the Edmondson sisters because they have a remarkable story. Sorry, excuse me. So who are they? Mary and Emily Edmondson, and I'll read, this is a little bit from my book too, so you'll get a sense. They were born into slavery in Montgomery County, Maryland in the 1830s. Their mother, Amelia, was enslaved, and their father, Paul, was a free black man. In their teens, the girls were hired out to work in private homes in Washington, D.C. But on the night of April 15th, 1848, along with 77 other enslaved men, women, and children, they secretly boarded the schooner Pearl and set sail for New Jersey and freedom, or so they thought. The tides and the wind were not in their favor, and a steamship sent by slaveholders captured and returned the fugitives to the city. So the Pearl incident, as it became known, was the largest recorded attempted escape of enslaved people in U.S. history. Mary and Emily were sold with other attempted escapees to traders and shipped to New Orleans. And there, because of their light skin, their age, the slave traders Bruin and Hill displayed the sisters on a public porch, offering them as sex slaves at $1,200 apiece. And that's about $50,000 today, by the way. And it was only because of a yellow fever epidemic that they were saved from this fate, because their owners were trying to protect their investment, so they got them out of New Orleans as quickly as they could to avoid this yellow fever epidemic, and they bring them back to Bruin and Hill slave jail in Alexandria, Virginia. So in the meantime, their father, Paul, had come to New York looking for help from the abolitionist community, thinking that maybe someone could help. And he found his way to Henry Ward Beecher, who used the girl's story to raise money for their release throughout the city. So he did one of these slave auctions or freedom auctions. How would you feel, he asked a congregation at the Broadway Tabernacle, if your daughter were kidnapped and sold to a man who would rape her, sell her children for profit, and whip her if she put up resistance? So you can get some sense of how explicit the appeal was. Right? Beecher did not pull punches. He raised the money, right, and then personally traveled to Alexandria, where he bought the Edmondson sisters' freedom on November 4th, 1848, and that was 7 months after their whole ordeal began. Now, after reuniting with their family, the sisters, they do well. They do pretty well. They attend New York City Central College with support from Plymouth Church, and they went to abolitionist rallies, including this one in Cazenovia, New York. And can you guys see? I'm not sure if you can see who they are. They're the ones with the big bonnets. One is seated and one is standing. And do you recognize the gentleman? Yeah. So we see Frederick Douglass, and this is one of the earliest pictures of Frederick Douglass. But he's seated in between the two sisters. And apparently they became pretty close. There was sort of a former slave circuit, if you would, that people would go around and talk and tell about what slavery was like, relating their stories, right? And they go on to, the sisters end up going on to Oberlin College, and do we know people who are Oberlin? Outstanding school. Unfortunately, Mary dies of tuberculosis, but Emily goes on, she graduates and she becomes a teacher. So there's a sort of a semi-happy ending for the Edmondson sisters. Remarkable story. I like to show this monument by Eric Blome, which is on the site of what was the Bruin and Hill slave jail in Alexandria, Virginia, and it shows the Edmondson sisters in a way that I like to think. You sort of imagine them on the night that they are setting out for freedom, right, or with what they hope would be freedom. Certainly a more dignified representation than what they have at Plymouth Church. I should say, just to be clear, Plymouth Church, I spoke there. It was one of the first talks I did about the book, and they're well aware of the problematic nature of that monument. They're actually in the midst of commissioning a statue of Frederick Douglass, which will sort of balance out the Henry Ward Beecher representation. So we'll see how that's supposed to happen in the next couple of years. They're trying to do that. So there's eventually some progress gets made. And this is the Harlem River Houses, Man the Provider and Woman the Mother and Housekeeper, by Heinz Warnecke. And we start seeing in Harlem an increase in the population, African American population, because of the Great Migration. And as that population increases, the need for housing increases. There's a whole sort of slum clearance process, and we have New York City and the federal government combining to come up with money for housing apartments, and that's where we get Harlem River Houses. And part of that is a commitment to build art, to create art, I should say, during the New Deal era, during the Depression. There's something called the Treasury Art Relief Program, which sets aside any federal project would set aside a percentage of the funds to build some art. And this, as far as I know, is the first public art, public statues which are built to represent the African American population, where we have an African American man and African American woman who are supposed to represent the people who are living in this this housing complex. So again, that feels like it's a little bit of progress, but there's still some wrinkles, of course. So the model that you see on the left, there was a housing committee which was made up of mostly of all African Americans, elite African Americans, including the unfortunately named Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP. I still can't get over the fact that his name was Walter White. But they take a look at this model of Man the Provider on the left, and they have some problems. What do we think their problems might be? Sorry? Scars? Oh, they look like a scar. That may just be a blip. His pecs. he's built. They're not happy with the fact that he's not wearing a shirt. They're wondering, why can't he be a businessman? Why can't he be in a coat and tie? Why does he have to be, naked from the waist up? They don't appreciate that. The artist, Heinz Wernicke, along with Richmond Barthé, you see is this gentleman here, who is a famous African-American sculptor, a big part of the Harlem Renaissance. He and Wernicke managed to convince the committee that, look, this is something we do in the art business. It's not. It's meant to be flattering. Not meant to demean him. So the committee sort of backs down. They're like, okay, but we're still not happy about the fact that his lips are big, and the fact that his nose is broad, right? And so they change it, right? They make it. If you look at the final version, smaller lips, smaller nose, right? And it's hard for, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not so hard for us to understand, but there's this concern, right? We talked about the concern that Frederick Douglass had about racist caricatures. This committee was very concerned about that, right? And if you think about some of the images that were abroad at that time, you see this, Bugs Bunny with racist caricatures. You see a chicken restaurant with a racist caricature. So the committee's like, no, we don't want to even come anywhere near that. So it gives you some sense of the impact of those kinds of stereotypes. Any questions before we go forward? Okay. So who do we think, New Yorkers or not? I know it's not fair if you're not from New York, but who's the first African-American historical figure, right? We've been focusing on symbolic representation, but who was the first sort of historical figure represented in a monument in New York City? Martin Luther King. No. That's a good guess. Harriet Tubman's a good guess too. Everyone loves Harriet Tubman. You're not going to find, sorry? Ooh, Jack Johnson. You're the first person to say Jack Johnson. He would have been great. Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, he would have been, but no. Not Arthur Ashe, but we do get, not Muhammad Ali, not Arthur Ashe, although we do eventually get to Arthur Ashe. Did you say Satchel Paige? Oh, Satchmo. No, and we should have Satchmo, right? Because he lived in Queens for a long time. John Lewis, no. Jackie Robinson, no. Okay, these are all great guesses. You guys are good. So no, it's none of those people. It's a sort of a political figure, and it's Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. And he's fully dressed. Yeah, no toga in sight. Although maybe whatever. So this is by Richmond Barthé. You can see, and this is if you're in New York. This statue is one of my favorite places. It's the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, which is at what is now the Bronx Community College. In 1901, when the Hall of Fame was created, it was part of the New York University Bronx campus. So Booker T goes in 1946, and just a little context, you mentioned Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson integrates baseball in 1947, and the American military is integrated in 1948, right? So this is sort of a reflection of what's going on in American culture. Right? Coming out of World War II, we're asking this question: how can we fight a war against fascism, and still have and still treat African Americans the way that we're treating them? There's lots of questions about that. But Booker T is also controversial because you may or may not know that Booker T was an accommodationist. Right? He was not someone who was pushing for civil rights as much as he was saying, look, I want African Americans to have jobs. I want economic opportunity, but I'm not looking for social equality. I don't want to eat it. I don't need to eat at the same restaurants, right? I don't need to ride on the same streetcars. I just want to have economic opportunity, which is he was someone who was born into slavery, and it's a very sort of realistic approach. Like, how do we to think about this? We're formerly enslaved people. How do we integrate into this society that wanted nothing to do with us, right? So it seems like a reasonable approach, right? But a lot of people have a lot of problems with this sort of accommodationist view. And he's, especially because he's seen as somebody who is very popular with white people, in particular white electors, right? Or I should say the white electors in the Hall of Fame were mostly university presidents, judges, and white. Interestingly, there was a campaign to have a monument for Frederick Douglass in the same year, the 1946 or 1945, but then it goes up in 46. And Frederick Douglass did not carry the day because Frederick Douglass is more controversial, more confrontational. Maybe not someone who white people were as comfortable with. Last thing about the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, just to be clear about their leanings, when they opened in 1901, Robert E. Lee is one of the statues that goes in there. So you have Abraham Lincoln, you have George Washington, you have all the usual greats, and then you get Robert E. Lee. And then in 1955, you get Stonewall Jackson. He goes into the Hall of Fame of Great Americans, for Great Americans. And then my favorite is there was a lady on the Upper West Side. There's an article in the New York Times. Some point in the mid '60s, she's still trying really hard to get Jefferson Davis into the Hall of Fame for Great Americans in the '60s, in the middle of the '60s. And her heart is full with the work, right? You have to understand these people completely believe in what they're doing. So interesting place, the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. You can still go see it. There's like hundreds of statues of great Americans. And the Marquis de Lafayette is the only non-American, if you're keeping track. Wendy, I think you mentioned MLK. Someone mentioned MLK. But we're starting to see, so this getting Booker T in, we start to see more representation of African Americans, historical figures. So Martin Luther King in 1970. This is at a co-op building. They basically come up with the idea that they want to honor him 2 years after his murder. They make that happen, but it's in a public space. We also get Jackie Robinson at the Jackie Robinson Recreation Center in Harlem, which is inside, but I had to count it because I think Jackie Robinson's so important. And Jackie Robinson's one of the only athletes who is one of the few athletes who's represented. Arthur Ashe will also go in. If you go to the USTA, you see Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson. But Jackie Robinson is also at the Maimonides Park down in Coney Island with Pee Wee Reese. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Who was the first Black American woman honored in public statue in New York City? Sojourner Truth? Close. Sorry? Ooh, Shirley Chisholm. I wish, right? Shirley Chisholm, no, but there is a plan for Shirley Chisholm. We'll talk about, I'll share that with you in a moment. Someone said Harriet Tubman. Okay, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's also Harriet Tubman is not controversial, right? Everyone loves her. There's a plan for her to go on the $20 bill to replace Andrew Jackson, although we'll see what's going on with the current administration. What should I show? What do I love about this monument? Just a couple things to show you. This is by Allison Sarr. It goes up in 2008. The roots, right in the back. Harriet Tubman, just to be clear, so I'm sorry, I just sort of assume everyone knows a little bit about her, but she was from Maryland, and she escapes when she's relatively young to Philadelphia, but she keeps coming back, and I think she saves over the course something like 17 people, many of her relations, she brings them out of slavery at great risk to her own, life. And so this statue is meant to represent a couple things. You see the roots. The roots are meant to be representing the ways in which enslaved people sort of uprooted their lives, right, and like she uprooted her life to escape. She actually left her. She had a husband who was free. She left him, and then later she comes back trying to get him to come north. Bless you. And he says, no, thanks, I'm good. I've met a nice lady here. I'm not coming. So she, on that run, she managed to grab some other people. So she uprooted her life, other people uprooted their lives. She's also uprooting slavery. And you can see in the skirt that she's wearing, there's the faces of enslaved people who she brought out of slavery, and also a lot of the things that they might have carried. What else? If you see her in her skirt, this thing at the sort of the hem, what do you think that represents? Yeah, railroad. So it's a cow catcher, right? And Allison Sarr is interesting because, we think about conductors on the Underground Railroad. There was no railroad as such, but they called people like Harriet Tubman conductors. But she said that she wanted this statue not to represent her as a conductor, but to represent her as the train itself, as the locomotive itself, right? So she's a force, this woman, who managed to free all these people and undermine slavery, the whole concept of slavery, right? If slavery is so great, how come everyone wants to escape it? There she is. One last thing, there's no monument without controversy. This monument was facing south. What's wrong with that? Why should she be facing north? That's where they were headed. They were headed north, right? So they're escaping slavery. There should be, and so people saw, they're like, how can you possibly have Harriet Tubman heading south? Well, you're right. It does actually fit in the place. It fits better in this little traffic island that they turned into this incredible site. It does actually fit better in the site. And so Allison Sarr, the artist, to respond to all this criticism, said, well, she risked her life most when she was heading south. Okay, so that kind of, but also from an artistic perspective, why would you rather have your statue facing south than north? Sun, all day long, right? For the most part, she's lit, as it were. But Frederick Douglass, who's down at 110th Street in Central Park West, he is facing north, right? Appropriately, because the North Star and all those kinds of things. But you can't. His light is terrible through much of the day, and the sculptor is not so happy about that. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Oh, the one other thing, my favorite thing about this, also, if she'd been heading north, can you see? I don't know. You can see over here, this building. Anyone guess what that building might be? It's a police station. So if she'd been heading north, she would have been heading right into the police station. Which, no, that's not a good look. Okay, so I'll just turn it over to you folks. If you think of people, if there are people from New York or people from MDI or wherever you're from, are there any any Black Americans you think deserve a monument here on the island or anywhere else? And then I'll be happy to take questions. Tell me about Ashley Bryan. The artist. Okay, Arthur, an artist, right? Okay. Ashley Bryan. Okay, and I've read. I don't, to be honest, I know who he is. I don't know much about him. Sorry, what? He lived on Little Cranberry for a while. He died how long? Okay. Okay. A huge problem. So, okay. So. Okay. Okay. So because he'd grown up in Harlem and hadn't experienced much discrimination, then he goes into the military and finds out what it's really like. Yeah, there's lots of New Yorkers have experiences, African American New Yorkers, but also Jewish New Yorkers who go and they're like, they go into these military bases in the South, and it's an eye-opening experience for a lot of them. Yeah, so Ashley Bryan's a great example. Anyone else? Malaga Island. Tell me about Malaga Island. This is good. Okay. So there's no sort of acknowledgement of that? Okay. Very little. Okay. In Schoodic, yeah. That was the one I was going to bring up. My understanding is he's the first documented free African American in Winter Harbor in Schoodic Peninsula. Thomas Fraser, who apparently this is like the colonial era. He enlisted in the company of Continental Army Rangers at Frenchman's Bay during the Revolutionary War, and he lived with his wife and 7 children for several decades in the area. So that's certainly someone who we could consider. Just one other, this is my own sort of personal issue. Does anyone know this? This is the first recorded, this is right around the corner. It's still there. This is perfect. Do you know about this? Okay, sorry. So this is a monument that was erected originally at Sea Bench, and we actually happen to have the residents of Sea Bench here. But it was for the first, and you can go around and see it. It's right over there at St. Ignatius, where my cousin Liza was married. She's over there. Hi, Liza. It's the first recorded landing of white persons on Mount Desert Island in 1613. So I actually wrote a little editorial, which I sent to the Mount Desert Islander, saying like, hey, why are we celebrating? You know, the implication here is that we should be celebrating the arrival of white people. Like that's that too. That's definitely important. It's both Christian. It's whiteness. It's celebrating white people and whites. Sorry, it's celebrating whiteness and Christianity. It's a celebration of, and so this was erected by the summer resident, a guy named John Joseph O'Brien, definitely Catholic, in 1952 at Sea Bench, and he donated it later to St. Ignatius. It's a celebration, I'd say it's a celebration of white colonization. The implicit message of the memorial is that white colonization was a good in itself. And more importantly, I was like, no consideration seemed to be given to the idea that there were other people here, right? So Chief Astiku, who gives he gives these French settlers the rights to fish there in what's now Fernald's Point. He said, go ahead, you guys use this, and then these people, and then the English end up completely wiping him and his people out. So, and there was no acknowledgement of that. And I wrote a little editorial on the Mount Desert Islander, which was widely ignored. That's okay. Okay, but I was like, this seems like there should be some acknowledgement of the Wabanaki people who were wiped out in a matter of decades, right, by disease. Yeah. The first summer residence? The first year-long residence? No. Oh, the first summer residence. Sorry, first. Okay. There's a great book, if you're interested, about monuments of Mount Desert Island by Donald Lenihan, Source of Memorials of Acadia National Park. If anyone's seen that, you can get it. Where can you get it? You can get it at local bookstores. You can get it at hey. You can get it. I'm sorry, thank you. Let's get the library plug. You can get it at the library, I'm sure. I don't have a copy, but I love that book. It's just these short essays about all these, like the Champlain Memorial or the seal in Seal Harbor. All right, so just some stuff to think about. What else? If you want, questions. Any questions? And I know we also have people at home who maybe have questions too. So we have hi. And we're going to make our way to you. My cousin Liza Clark has a question. Hopefully it's not too tough.
Do you mind just holding that close to your mouth? And
Do we need a microphone? Hello. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
I'm assuming the last one was done by an African-American artist?
Harriet Tubman.
Yeah.
Yeah, Allison Sarr is African-American.
And was that the only one done by a Black artist, or was any of the other ones? Oh, you did a few. There were a few others.
Did Allison Sarr did? Well,
I'm curious about her other work, and then
Allison Sarr's she's done other sort of she's done figurative work, she's done painting and stuff like that, but she hasn't done any public statues like this.
Yeah.
But there are so Jackie is an African American artist, Inga Hardison. Most of them are by African American artists. So someone just mentioned Invisible Man, which is my favorite. I can show you this, Invisible Man. Invisible Man, the Ralph Ellison Memorial on the Upper West Side. There's a lot. There's quite a few. So this is Elizabeth Catlett, and my sister's actually been to this one. Was it 153rd, 55th? And River, I'm terrible with numbers. Riverside Park. Yeah, and good point. And a lot of the statues actually use Deer Isle granite. But to answer your question, I would say most of the artists, most of the sculptors are African American. And Elizabeth Catlett, who is responsible for this particular monument, African-American, part of the Black Arts movement, and incredible artist, known for like printmaking. She lived in Mexico most of her life and was part of like the Talla Grafico, so connected with that whole group of artists, sort of very political art. My favorite thing about this is if you read The Invisible Man, the story of the Invisible Man, it's this idea that, you know, he's invisible because people simply choose not to see him. But what she's done here is by sort of creating this cutout of him, she makes this person who is invisible visible for all time. I think it's such a neat trick. And this is in the park that Ralph Ellison used to spend a lot of time in, and it's looking behind him. Behind the statue is the apartment building that he lived in. Someone also mentioned, somebody mentioned my favorite, Shirley Chisholm. So this is planned for her, but it hasn't, it was supposed to go up 2023. This is on Prospect Park and Flatbush. Supposed to go in like a couple years in Brooklyn. Prospect Park in Brooklyn, sorry. And yeah, it was supposed to go in a few years ago, but they're having issues. I don't know why it's not going in. Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
Paul.
Hey,
How you
Paul.
going? I mean, given that it's in New York, but I guess it's not really in some ways part of New York. Did you have a look at any of the memorials or monuments in the United Nations building in terms of the connection between human rights and?
Because there's like is there like a Fritz Koenig in the little park just north of the United Nations?
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
And also in the building itself, I mean, there's stuff sort of spread around in corners, but I thought it might be of some interest.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm mostly focused on things that are publicly accessible. So, for example, there's a great statue of Martin Luther King on the campus of Brooklyn College, which is outdoors, but you can't access it because there's this, gates and things like that. But no, the United Nations is a good place. I'll take a look. There's Ralph Bunche Park, which is across the street from the UN, but there's no. Which makes sense. But there's no figurative statue to him, and I'm focused really on physical, figurative representations of these people. Any other questions? Yes. None. No. No. First of all, as I said, just talking with them about monuments and I teach, so it's American history, 11th grade. And so we talk about monuments, as I mentioned, a fair amount. I did, which I don't really talk about, I don't talk about it so much in the book, but I did take an early trip to the Lafayette Memorial with a group of 10th graders. So the Lafayette Memorial in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, it's the Marquis de Lafayette. Sorry, there he is. And he is, the Marquis is looking fantastic in front of his horse, as he might have looked before the Battle of Yorktown. But his groom, or whoever this gentleman is who's holding the horse, right? You know what horses do, they'll take a little nip at you. So there was a question about the identity of this man. So I wrote a paper for the Gazette of the Lafayette. Sorry, it's the American Gazette. It's the Lafayette Society's publication, which has been around since the 40s, I guess. And I wrote a piece about who is this African American man holding the horse in the Lafayette statue, and because there's lots of questions about that. So that was one of the things. Story short. One of the ways I was like, oh, well, how are Black Americans being represented? And so my students helped me with that, but none of the research. Any other questions? No? Okay, you guys have been great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.